Welcome to the Surgical Edge podcast for surgical insights, reviews, discussions, and to stay updated. Let's dive in.
You know the feeling. You are standing in the middle of a completely chaotic emergency department or maybe an acute medical unit, and it is a Friday night.
Oh, it is always a Friday night, isn't it?
Right. Always. And the one thing you never have enough of is space. The bed manager is calling you, the waiting room is overflowing, and every single bed is basically gold dust.
Yeah, you're fighting for every inch of real estate.
Exactly. So when a patient rolls in with the suspected acute upper gastrointestinal bleed, you are instantly caught in this high-stakes waiting game. Like, do they need an urgent scope? Do you just admit them just in case?
And usually the default is to just admit them.
Because you don't want to take the risk. But what if a simple scoring system could safely send, say, 15 to 20% of those patients home right from the front door, without a scope, freeing up massive capacity?
I mean, that is the reality of the Glasgow-Blatchford Score, or the GBS. It essentially solves one of the biggest bottlenecks in acute care by evaluating risk before a camera ever goes down into the stomach.
Right. And today, we are unpacking this score specifically for you. The surgeons, the ED doctors, the medical professionals who are actually managing these tough calls on the front line.
Yeah, the ones actually making the decisions at 2 in the morning.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are pulling from a really solid stack of sources today. We've got nice guidelines, guidings from the British Society of Gastroenterology, the BSG, along with some BMJ articles and PubMed validation studies.
A lot of heavy hitters in the literature.
Tons of data. We want to see how this pre-endoscopy risk stratification tool actually performs when the pressure is on. But before we get into the clinical weeds, we have to state our mandatory disclaimer.
Oh, yes. Very important.
This content is for reference only. You must always follow your local guidelines and hospital protocols in your own clinical practice.
And, that local context is key, because your local setup changes how you use these tools. But to really understand why the GBS is so heavily endorsed by those national guidelines, we have to look at the traditional workflow it disrupted.
Let's trace that timeline. A patient presents with melena, or maybe hematemesis. Historically, there was this massive reliance on getting the endoscopy done just to figure out their actual risk level.
Right, the scope was the triage tool.
Exactly. You admit them, they occupy a precious bed. You make them nil by mouth, they are miserable and hungry, and you just wait for the gastroenterologist to arrive.
Which could be the next morning or even after the weekend in some places. You are waiting to see the anatomy to make a physiological decision.
Right.
And the thing is, acute upper GI bleeding is incredibly common, but a significant portion of these patients won't ever actually need a hospital-based intervention.
Like they're just going to stop bleeding on their own.
Exactly. They won't need a blood transfusion, they won't need endoscopic hemostasis, and they certainly won't need surgery. But without a reliable pre-endoscopy tool, the default was always admission.
I think a lot of people reflexively think of the Rockall score here as the gold standard. When you say GI bleed, people think Rockall.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It is drilled into us in medical school.
But Rockall is fundamentally frustrating at the front door because it requires you to have already scoped the patient, right? I mean, you need to know if there's a visible vessel or a clean Oser base to calculate the full Rockall score.
Yeah, exactly. The Rockall score is fantastic, but it is for predicting mortality after you've had a look.
Yeah.
The GBS, however, was designed specifically as a screening tool at presentation.
Before the scope.
Way before. You do your initial ABCDE resuscitation, you get IV access, you send off your bloods, including a cross-match, and once those basic lab results and vital signs are back, you have everything you need.
You literally do not need to look inside the stomach.
You don't. You don't need a gastroenterologist in the room to calculate it.
It is like assessing a car's engine trouble just by reading the dashboard warning lights rather than having to tear the entire engine block apart to see if it's safe to drive.
That is a great way to look at it.
But, okay, let me play devil's advocate for a second. Is it really safe to make a definitive triage decision, like completely discharging someone, without actually laying eyes on the bleed? If I'm the surgical registrar on take, sending a melena patient home feels incredibly risky without visual proof that they aren't going to crash in 3 hours.
Well, what's fascinating here is that the GBS isn't trying to diagnose the cause of the bleed. It actually doesn't care if it is a Mallory-Weiss tear or peptic ulcer disease.
Wait, it doesn't care at all?
Not at this stage. It answers one highly specific question. How likely is this patient to need an intervention?
Ah, okay.
If they're managed as an outpatient, will they need blood, surgery, endoscopic therapy, or will they die? The validation data consistently shows that those dashboard lights, the physiological markers, are actually superior at predicting that need for intervention than waiting for the scope.
Wow. So if we are trusting these dashboard lights to predict outcomes and essentially protect our clinical registration when we discharge someone, we really need to understand the mechanics of the math.
We do. We need to look under the hood.
Because we aren't just summing up random numbers here. The score is evaluating circulating volume, ongoing bleeding, and comorbidity. Let's look at blood urea first, because the weighting here is massive.
It is the heaviest hitter in the whole score.
Right. You can score up to 6 points just for a severely elevated urea. So anything over 25 millimoles per liter gets you 6 points. Even a mild elevation, like between 6.5 and 7.9, gets you 2 points. Why is a renal marker dominating a GI bleed score?
Because in the context of an upper GI bleed, urea acts as a brilliant dual-purpose indicator. First off, it is a direct marker of blood digestion.
Because the blood goes down into the bowel.
Exactly. When you bleed into your stomach or duodenum, the gut breaks down those red blood cells. That creates a massive nitrogen load, which is absorbed into the bloodstream and converted into urea by the liver.
So the bigger the bleed, the more blood is digested, the higher the urea spikes.
Yes. And secondly, it indicates hypoperfusion.
Yeah.
If the patient is actively bleeding, their intravascular volume drops.
Which means the kidneys take a hit.
Right. That reduces renal perfusion, meaning the kidneys aren't clearing urea effectively, causing it to build up even more in the serum. So a high urea tells you two things at once. The patient has bled a lot, and their body is struggling to compensate for the volume loss.
That dual mechanism makes it incredibly sensitive. It is doing double duty. Then we have hemoglobin, which also carries a maximum of 6 points. But what stood out to me in the BMJ papers is the sex-specific thresholds.
Yeah, that is a really crucial detail.
For men, you start scoring points the second it drops below 130 grams per liter. But for women, they don't score any points until it drops below 120. Why build that distinction into a rapid triage tool?
It comes down to baseline physiological reserves. Women naturally have a lower baseline hemoglobin due to menstruation and differences in body composition.
Sure, that makes sense.
So hemoglobin of 125 in a woman might represent her completely normal state, whereas in a man, it represents a significant acute drop from a normal baseline of, say, 140 or 150.
Ah, I see.
If the score did not adjust for sex, you would end up artificially inflating the risk for female patients and unnecessarily admitting them for what is actually their physiological normal.
That is a critical nuance. We are tracking the relative drop, not just an absolute arbitrary number. Okay, looking at the hemodynamic markers next, the threshold for systolic blood pressure is remarkably conservative.
It catches people out sometimes.
I bet. You start scoring points if the systolic drops below 110 millimeters of mercury. 100 to 109 gets you 1 point, 90 to 99 gets you 2 points, and under 90 gets you 3 points. But 109 is a perfectly normal blood pressure for a lot of people. Why is the leash so tight?
Because in an acute bleed, a systolic of 105 might mean the patient has already lost a liter of blood and is maxing out their compensatory mechanisms.
Wow, a whole liter.
Yeah, especially in young, healthy patients. They can maintain a normal blood pressure through profound vasoconstriction and tachycardia until they suddenly just fall off a cliff.
The classic physiological crash.
Exactly. The GBS does not wait for overt hypotension. It flags the earliest potential signs of compensation. Combined with a pulse of 100 or more, which adds another point, it catches that early sympathetic drive.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The clinical features act as heavy modifiers, too. Melena adds 1 point, syncope adds 2. And past medical history is heavily penalized. If they have hepatic disease, that is 2 points. Cardiac failure is another 2 points. I imagine the hepatic disease points aren't just about general fragility.
Far from it. Hepatic disease instantly introduces two severe physiological complications, the high probability of variceal bleeding and underlying coagulopathy.
Right, their clotting factors are already a mess.
A cirrhotic patient who bleeds does not stop bleeding easily, period. Similarly, cardiac failure means the patient cannot tolerate the physiological stress of volume loss.
Because their heart cannot mount that tachycardic response we just talked about.
Exactly. They can't pump faster to maintain perfusion. If they drop their hemoglobin, they are at immediate risk of a type 2 myocardial infarction.
So when you stack all these variables together, the picture becomes incredibly clear. Achieving a GBS of 0 requires absolute physiological perfection. Normal urea, normal hemoglobin for your sex, a systolic BP of at least 110, a pulse under 100, an absolutely 0 high-risk clinical history. It is a very tight net.
And that tight net is deliberate. We are looking for a threshold to safely discharge patients. You want a tool that is hypersensitive to the slightest physiological derangement.
Let's take this out of the theoretical and into the trenches. I have a patient, I have done the math, and the score is 0. The guidelines from NICES and the BSG are unified here. A GBS of 0 is the gold standard for safe discharge.
Yes, that is the universally accepted cutoff.
But in practice, if I am staring at an anxious patient in the ED, am I legally and clinically protected if I send them home, just based on this number?
The evidence overwhelmingly supports you. Large-scale validation studies demonstrate that a patient with a true GBS of 0 has a near-zero risk of requiring an intervention or dying.
Near 0.
Yes. Sending them home to have an urgent outpatient endoscopy isn't just acceptable, it is best practice. It protects them from hospital-acquired infections, right? And it keeps a bed open for someone who truly needs it.
Okay, but what about pushing the envelope? The recent literature mentions centers that are extending this outpatient management to a GBS of 1 or even 2.
Yeah, that is becoming a lot more common.
Let's say I have a 30-year-old guy with a pulse of 102 because he is anxious about seeing blood in his stool, but everything else is perfect. That is a GBS of 1. The math says they have a negative predictive value of 98 to 100% for not needing intervention. But clinical anxiety is a real thing. If I discharge a GBS 1 and they crash later, how defensible is that?
It is highly defensible, but, and this is a big but, it has to be supported by your local hospital trust protocols.
So you can't just go rogue.
Definitely not. The data shows that the negative predictive value, the certainty that they won't need a hospital-based intervention, remains incredibly high at scores of 1 or 2. However, moving the threshold from 0 to 1 requires robust local governance.
What does that mean in practice?
You need to know that your outpatient endoscopy pathway is rapid and reliable. If a GBS 1 patient cannot get an outpatient scope for 3 weeks, discharging them becomes much riskier.
That makes complete sense. It is not just about the score. It is about the system backing the score. The system has to catch them.
Exactly.
Now, what happens when the math goes the other way? Let's say the score starts climbing. We admit them, obviously, but how do we prioritize them for the endoscopy list? Because the list is always overbooked.
The risk escalation is steep. Once a patient hits a score of 6, validation cohorts show a greater than 50% risk of needing an intervention.
Wait, 50%?
Yes. It's literally a coin flip on whether they will require a blood transfusion, endoscopic clipping, or surgery.
Let's visualize that. A patient with a mildly elevated urea of, say, 10, a systolic of 95, and melena is already at a 6. That doesn't sound like a catastrophic presentation when you look at them, but you are saying that is a 50-50 shot of needing an intervention.
Yes, and that is why the score is so valuable. It reveals the hidden risk that you might miss just by eyeballing them from the end of the bed. And when you hit a score of 7 or higher, the sensitivity for predicting the need for hospital-based treatment reaches about 96%.
So a GBS of 7 or 8 is not just an admission, it is a red alert.
Absolutely.
That is a patient who needs to be considered for a high-dependency unit or the ICU. You are initiating an early senior multidisciplinary discussion. You're talking to gastroenterology for an emergency scope, you're involving anesthetics, and you're prepping interventional radiology or surgery just in case.
And, that multidisciplinary aspect is arguably the GBS's second greatest strength, right behind bed management.
How so?
Because it relies on objective physiological data, it creates a universal language across the hospital.
Oh, I see what you mean. If I call the interventional radiology consultant at 2 a.m. and say, I have a patient with melena who looks a bit pale and sweaty, that is incredibly subjective. They might think it can wait until morning.
Right, pale and sweaty means different things to different doctors.
What if I say, I have a 65-year-old with a GBS of 10, their urea is 18, and they have ongoing transfusion needs? That instantly cuts through the noise.
It paints a unified clinical picture. The surgeon, the medic, the intensive care consultant, everyone immediately understands the acuity. It streamlines the triage for limited theater space and IR suites.
So what does this all mean for the limitations? Because no algorithm is flawless, and relying on the math blindly can lead to disaster. Let's run through those blind spots.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, You have to remember the context. You mentioned earlier that the GBS doesn't care about the cause of the bleed, but clinically, etiology matters immensely.
Right. If it's a bleeding ulcer versus bleeding varices, those are two totally different ballgames.
It matters entirely. The GBS predicts the need for intervention, but it does not guide specific medical therapy for varices. If you have a patient with suspected variceal bleeding, say they have known cirrhosis or stigmata of chronic liver disease, they require a specific management bundle.
They need terlipressin.
They need prophylactic antibiotics, and they need an urgent scope, regardless of whether their GBS is a 3 or a 12.
Right. Varices do not play by the same rules. They can rebleed catastrophically without any warning. And there is another major limitation. It doesn't incorporate endoscopic stigmata. We touched on this with Rockall, but the GBS can't tell you what the pathology actually looks like.
It lacks those visual red flags you only see once the camera is in, like an actively spurting vessel or an adherent clot. The GBS gets the right patient to the endoscopy suite at the right time. That is its job.
But once you are in there...
Once you are in there and you see the source of the bleeding, the GBS has done its job.
Yeah.
You need a post-endoscopy tool, like the full Rockall score, to prognosticate the risk of rebleeding and mortality from that point forward.
It is a relay race. GBS runs the first leg to clear the front door, and Rockall runs the second leg in the gastro ward.
That is a perfect analogy.
And I think the biggest pitfall of all is the temptation to let the score override your own clinical gestalt. If I have an 85-year-old patient who lives alone, is deeply frail, and scores a 0 or a 1, the math says discharge. But common sense says no.
Clinical judgment is king.
Yeah.
Always. The GBS evaluates physiology. It does not evaluate frailty, cognitive impairment, or social support.
If they can't call an ambulance if they start vomiting blood again.
Exactly. If they cannot reliably return to the hospital, or if there is severe diagnostic uncertainty about whether the melena is actually just, from iron tablets they started taking, they merit admission. You use the score to support your judgment, not to replace it.
It gives you an objective, evidence-based framework to defend safe outpatient management, but you still have to be a doctor first. Man, we have covered a massive amount of ground today.
We really have.
We have broken down the dual mechanism of urea, the sex-specific nuances of hemoglobin, and how to basically weaponize this math to protect beds and communicate across the MDT.
It is a really powerful tool when used correctly. And as we look forward, I will leave you with a final thought to mull over. As healthcare continues to move toward integrated digital systems, how long until scores like the GBS are fully automated by the electronic health record?
Oh, wow. That would be huge.
Imagine a scenario where the second the lab results hit the system, the EHR instantly prompts a safe discharge pathway for a score of 0, or automatically triggers an ICU alert for a score of 8, without a clinician ever having to manually calculate it on their phone. It could completely revolutionize the speed of front door triage.
That is a fascinating direction, and it feels like it is right around the corner. It would take so much of the cognitive load right off the ED floor. You wouldn't have to scramble for a calculator while a trauma is rolling in next door.
Exactly. It just seamlessly integrates into the workflow.
Well, if you liked this content, then do not forget to share it with at least one of your colleagues or friends and spread the word. Also, be sure to check out our YouTube and other social media pages. And definitely do check our previous season and episodes, as we've covered some very relevant topics for your clinical practice.
Yeah, some really great deep dives in the back catalog.
So the next time you are standing in that packed ED on a Friday night, staring at those dashboard warning lights, remember that you don't always have to take the engine apart to know what's going on. Sometimes the math is all you need to keep things moving safely. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Surgical Edge podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Help us grow and deliver even more relevant surgical content by pressing the support button. Your contribution truly makes a difference. And don't forget to share with us your advice, feedback, and the topics you would like us to include.